Welcome to How Positive Are You, episode 39. This is Terry Michael in Washington, D.C., joined by my co-host, David Crow in Calgary, Alberta. Hello, David.
Hi, Terry. It's good to be back after a little bit of a break with some vacation and other things that interfered with taping How Positive Are You. I have a little bit of feedback since our last episode. Gabrielle in the UK wrote to us and said, "What a fabulous job you are both doing. Thank you so much. I was re-listening to the podcast with David Rasnick, and you almost touched on a question I've had for a while, which is, in a world in which HIV, the virus or the notion of it, did not exist, would a high viral load count and a low CD4 count be indicators of some sort of pathological process going on in the subject's body? I'd very much appreciate it if you could either raise that question in one of your future podcasts or point me in the direction to find some articles that touch on this question." It won't go into a lot of detail. I pointed him to some lists of scientific quotes related to both CD4 counts and viral load. But one thing I can say is that whenever they test healthy people for CD4 counts, a small percentage of them will have very low counts with no detectable illness. On the other hand, there are many illnesses that do depress CD4 counts. So the counts do appear to have some meaning, not the religious meaning attached to them with HIV and AIDS.
And I would add, David, that some illnesses, the CD4 counts spike. They go way up. This is a really good question, and one that I actually was just considering today before we started taping. What do these counts mean? Where did the normal range ever come from? And what is the normal range for HIV-negative gay males, for example? We really don't know any of that.
No.
So it's really a question that maybe our listeners can help provide some answers, lead us to some documentation. Where do those numbers come from?
And maybe one day we can have a guest who's particularly an expert in these areas and discuss this at greater length. But for now, I'll put some links in the show notes for episode 39, and hopefully that will help Gabrielle and other people with these questions.
I think Matt Irwin's papers on both of those questions, CD4s and viral load, would be helpful.
Yes. We also got a fairly lengthy email from a man named Jonathan. For obvious reasons, I'm not going to give his full name. And he described a story that's remarkably parallel to the episode with a man named Juan. He was a young gay man. He had a perianal abscess that ruptured, and he was told he was HIV positive, and all the focus went on to starting the drugs. He became very depressed. He started preparing himself for taking the drugs for a slow, painful death. A friend recommended he watched House of Numbers, and he brushed him off. But he was on YouTube a little later, and he saw, some of you may have seen this, a post-House of Numbers interview with Carrie Stokely and a man who was taking the drugs. And he was struck with how the man taking the drugs looked, the sunken face and the other aspects. And so based on that, he did in the end watch House of Numbers, and then he not only decided not to take the drugs, but his whole frame of mind changed. He became happy again and returned to his normal life, understanding that HIV meant nothing to him. So that's our feedback for this week, and I encourage people who have thoughts about the podcasts to go on to the website, howpositiveareyou.com. You can register for free, and you can post comments that will be shown with each episode, and often we have a discussion that occurs after the episodes. If you like it, if you don't like it, if you want to suggest a guest, a topic, we're anxious to hear anything. Anyway, I'd like to move on to our very special guest today. Brian is the man who tested HIV positive in 1987. He's never taken any AIDS drugs and is still healthy today. By the way, Brian is not his real name, and his voice has been altered to protect his identity. It's also very important to understand that Brian is a hemophiliac. So maybe we can start, Brian, by having you explain what hemophilia is and how it affects your life and that of others with this condition.
Okay, hemophilia is a hereditary disease that affects 1 in 10,000 males. It's carried by the female and manifested in the male. In my case, it was I believe, it's a spontaneous genetic mutation because there was no family history of the disease. What it boils down to is that certain genes don't produce the factor VIII protein responsible for clotting. So any minor injury can turn into a severe injury. Any minor bruise, cut, and whatnot can cause severe pain, injury, arthritis, that type of thing.
Right. So if you get cut, if you're not treated as a hemophiliac, then you could just bleed to death.
That's right. Because in the 1960s and prior to that, hemophiliacs were not expected to live beyond adolescence. You were lucky if you lived to 5 years old, and that type of thing. So it's a terrible illness until the advent of modern treatments, and starting in the late 60s and 70s onwards.
And what were those treatments?
It started from whole blood, which was a terrible treatment in which the patients, as I mentioned, would die quickly. And then there was other things which were called cryo, which were a mixture of foreign proteins, and actually it was almost 99% foreign proteins, and then a small amount of factor VIII protein mixed into the batch, and it would be flushed out of the system very quickly. It wasn't stable, not purified, and hemophiliacs often got sick from that because it was so unstable. It was better than whole blood, but it was not a stable treatment. The treatments over the decades improved dramatically, but maybe we could just backtrack.
You were telling me earlier that the current treatments are a synthetic factor VIII protein. So whereas even in the early 80s, a lot of people were being injected with extracts of blood, now you're being extracted with a genetically modified protein.
That's right. That's a very important point, because what happened is, this is an important point, that the treatment of hemophilia had improved dramatically just approaching the AIDS era. I mean, mind you, hemophilia, for the older hemophiliacs, could be a life-threatening condition because they had been given the poorer, less stable product over time. But gradually, as the treatment improved, there was less of a blood component in it. It was starting to become genetically engineered. There were, of course, foreign proteins still that were being injected. Other things which would eventually be removed from the treatment. But by and large, hemophiliacs were expecting a longer life expectancy, better health, and more direct treatment of the bleed. That is to say, the bleeding and swelling would be reduced faster with the treatment.
Now, originally, this treatment was made from the blood of donors.
Yeah, that's right. Sometimes thousands of donors.
Yes. Today, when you say it's genetically engineered, are we saying that today's treatment doesn't come from the blood products of other donors?
No, actually, today's treatment, they use something like hamster cells, and then they genetically engineer the protein and manufacture it, and then there almost no blood at all in treatment today. It's entirely synthetic.
So when AIDS came along at that era,
yes,
we were still talking about it being synthesized from the blood products of thousands of donors. Therefore, all kinds of proteins, and this is a key word here,
yes,
could be introduced.
Absolutely. The proteins themselves were an assault on the body. So hemophiliacs were, generally speaking, immunosuppressed. And you could use the word age and dose related. The older hemophiliacs got the worst type of exposure to blood in general from thousands of donations. So that you would expect them to be, and they were sicker. The younger hemophiliacs like me, who were tested in the late 80s, who are now in their teens, by and large, except for the symptoms of hemophilia, and depending on how much doses they got and how many bleeds they got, were reasonably healthy. I mean, I would say this: if you were to see a hemophiliac in their late teens walking on the street, you could not differentiate them unless they had a bleed at that time and they had a swollen joint or they were in pain. You could not differentiate them from a regular person. But the treatment was that good, and at that time.
So in the early 1980s, when gay males were presenting with illnesses that were then later attributed to a mysterious retrovirus, the immunosuppression that we were seeing in the hemophiliacs at that point in time could very easily have been from these foreign proteins having nothing to do with the retrovirus.
That's my contention. I mean, and the medical literature supports that, although it's been ignored today. Generally speaking, the older hemophiliacs were not healthy people. I mean, you imagine just injecting blood into you from thousands of donations over and over. A typical hemophiliac would take 2 doses a week. So that's a lot of injections. I mean, I wouldn't call them a junkie like in that respect, because it's not like that, but you could say that they were injecting a lot. I mean, this was quite an assault on the body.
Well, I've read some places that it's well known that blood transfusions are immunosuppressive, and sometimes that's used to the advantage of doctors who maybe are doing a transplant or something. They know that massive blood transfusions will reduce the risk of rejection because the immune system is tamped down.
Right.
And so it wouldn't be surprising if that was happening. I think there were several papers that showed that the lifetime quantity of factor VIII, of low purity factor VIII, was correlated with CD4 counts, going back to CD4 counts, but lifetime quantity of high purity factor VIII was not. It did not have an impact on the immune system.
That's right. I mean, that's ignored in the medical literature too, that the younger hemophiliacs of today, many are not even reactive on the test, on the different tests they use, and because there's much less of these foreign proteins and these other things in what they're injecting. But at that time in the 80s, I think the statistic was something like 70 to 80% of all hemophiliacs at that time were reactive on the so-called HIV tests.
Let's get to your test now, if we can, and set this in time. Now, in respect to your privacy, we don't want to give a lot of details of your life, but can you tell us about how old you were and about what year you were tested and found to be, quote, positive, unquote?
Okay, I want to mention it because it's quite dramatic, in terms of the psychological impact and how it was done at the hospital. And I just want to recreate, maybe in my mind, because this is important for the hemophiliacs that are dead and can't speak, what it was really like at that time to be given that label. And just as a preface, because these people cannot speak, and in a sense I'm speaking for them, that they were living in complete terror. Imagine growing up, taking these doses of the factor twice a week, having severe trauma from bleeds and injections, joint bleeds and whatnot, constant pain, going to the hospital all the time, having joint trouble, dealing with family issues, relationships, this type of thing. They were a very, you could say, stressed set of people. So this was 1987 now. There was a lot of hysteria at the hospital. They were calling in all the hemophiliacs to be tested. Usually, when you would go in for a routine checkup, they took blood and whatnot. But I knew that quite a few of my peers were testing positive, so I figured that they had already taken blood and that they were going to call me in.
And how old were you at the time?
17. 17, yeah.
In 1987. Okay, go ahead with the story.
Yes. So I was called into the hospital ward, and they put me and my parents in separate rooms, and then the doctor came and said, you're positive. This is a terrible tragedy. Something to the effect like a death sentence, like it was that dramatic, because these doctors and nurses definitely believed it was a death sentence, and at that time I was crying. I was kind of skeptical about things, I tell you, though, because I was healthy. Aside from the symptoms of hemophilia, I did not believe that I was at risk for any disease. In fact, coming to the hospital, I figured I was going to be told that I was positive, and I even had a discussion with my mom at the dinner table a couple of nights before, And I mean, I had a rudimentary understanding of biology, high school biology. And my mom, she was well read on a lot of things. She wasn't a medical expert, but we had this long conversation, and where she kept telling me antibodies are a good thing. I don't see, this theory makes no sense whatsoever. You should be completely healthy. You should be protected. You have antibodies. That's a good thing.
And antibody tests are a test for proteins, a set of proteins believed to be specific to an antibody to a specific pathogen. Right. So again, I think the key word here is we're talking about the blood of hemophiliacs being having all kinds of proteins swimming around in that blood.
It wasn't proof that it was from that specific pathogen at all. I mean, at that time, the assumption was that you test positive, it is for the positivity is caused by reaction to HIV antibody reaction. But even if it was pathogenic, from the point of view of antibody reactivity, you would be protected. I mean, it would be rendered neutralized. That was my understanding of that.
Well, two things. There's prior to 1987, and we'll get into why 1987 was a special year, apart from the fact that it's the year you tested positive in a minute. But prior to 1987, there was an elevated risk of illness amongst HIV-positive hemophiliacs, but one needs to remember that the HIV positivity was correlated with increased lifetime dosage of impure factor VIII.
That's right.
So there's an explanation for why that slightly elevated risk might have occurred.
They didn't differentiate at all and think through these things. They just said, okay, you're positive, it's a virus. They didn't look at it and say, well, your body has been under assault for all these years and you have an elevated antibody response and all of that. There was no logic or deep thinking in that. It was basically the doctor was a robot. You're positive, you have a pathogen, you're going to die. It was that simple. That's how they behaved, and that's the terror they imposed on the patient.
But there was a but. They had something to offer you in 1987.
So let's get back to your narrative. Now, you were crying in the waiting room there, and then then what happened?
I told the doctor, I said, I don't believe in this. I really don't. I said, I had a discussion with my mom, and she said that my positivity, my antibody reactivity, or whatever the test is, can't be proof of a virus. And and the doctor said, no, you're wrong. Any antibody response in this test it's bad, and you're at risk for death. And that was the conversation. He was trying to keep, I think, reassuring or justifying himself that he was right. But I didn't believe it. I mean, my mom had a strong influence on me, and so I came from my parents are questioning people, so I kind of had that going for me. But the number one thing in my mind was that I was healthy. So I kind of ran with that. I said to myself, they keep saying I'm at risk for death, but I'm not. I'm not sick. I'm healthy. So I just tried to keep that going in my mind and say, okay, I'll take the next step. But but they were trying to paint it as that you could die. It's a deathly situation. Your time is limited, and drastic action would need to be taken.
So when you went to the hospital for this test, you had no presenting illnesses when you went to the hospital. You just went in to take the test.
From hemophilia itself. I mean, some patients had more of a reactivity to the foreign proteins in the factor product. I wasn't one of those, luckily. I mean, I did have the odd reaction to a treatment once in a blue moon, but more or less 99% of my problem was just the bleeding episodes. And in fact, at some point in the 80s, I had an operation for ankle swelling. One particular ankle.
So let's get to what then the doctor tried to recommend to you.
Well, after that, within I would classify it as a 2-year period with that, beyond after the test. There was a lot of communication between the nurse and my mom, sort of on the lines of you should get your son on medications as a preventative measure. If you don't do that, you're not being a good parent. that type of thing. I was in university in the around '89 until the early 1990s, and they would call a lot, and but my mom, myself, we were aware of the conditions of the other hemophiliacs, of the symptoms.
Were you acquainted personally with other hemophiliacs?
Yes,
was this a small community? How many? You're in an urban area. Are we talking thousands, hundreds, dozens?
Just from what I would see at the clinic, I met some of them shortly before they died. They were all on drugs like AZT, and they had terrible side effects: anemia, hair loss, weight loss, gauntness, loss of appetite, premature aging.
How many would you say you were personally acquainted with totally in the community of hemophiliacs?
Well, I would say under 20. I mean, that I knew very well. Because what would happen is they would have different appointments and different days at the clinic and whatnot, so I didn't get to see all of them. But
were almost all of them going on these drugs?
Oh, absolutely. They got, my peers who were at my age at the time, in their late teens, they got compliance in the high 90s. It's almost all of them, were. And all of them that took the high dose AZT, died within a few years. It was just sheer horror.
So you were really almost unique in refusing to take the drugs, then?
That was the thing. I mean, it's like escaping a concentration camp, in a way. Because over the years there were different attempts to enforce this, which I'll enforce compliance, and I'll mention one incident.
Yeah, please.
Just before I get to that, I just wanted to mention that in a conversation with my mom, they made it appear to the parents that you weren't doing your good duty as a parent if you didn't obey the doctor's orders. This was the kind of guilt complex, and I think it was passed on to the child that if you had any questioning thought, if you wanted to do your own research or do anything, you're not only bad as a patient, but you were just the idea of defying your doctor or nurse. It was like committing a crime. It was an insult. You were wrong, and you were rebuked. They would call you and they would make it known that they didn't like it. You were
like a Holocaust denialist, as they call us.
Yeah. And so, on top of everything, all the pain, stigma, and the terror that they were living on, there was pressure to be good, to do the right thing. And but my mom, I have to thank her again at that time, because even when she mentioned the conversation that she had with the nurse, and she said to her, look, I've heard about the other hemophiliacs, that they're getting up at 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. in the morning. They're throwing up. They're having diarrhea. They look very sickly. But my son is healthy right now. I don't want him on those medications, and why would I want to push him to take it if he doesn't have any symptoms at all? Aside from hemophilia, of course. But that was the response of my mom, and of course they backed off a bit. Before I forgot, I wanted to mention one incident that just to show you the type of terror and control they had. This is about 5-6 years ago, and after all these years of more or less good health, aside from hemophilia, I wasn't at risk for anything, just regular checkups and whatnot. I was at the clinic one day in particular, and the doctor walked in, and he just marched in, and he said, "I'm putting you on drugs today. This is non-negotiable. You're not leaving here unless you take the drugs." And by this time, I had read a lot of the scientific literature. I knew I was already a dissident. This was in I think now the early 2000s and whatnot. And I told the doctor, I just said, "There's absolutely no way I'm taking those drugs. No way." And that's the end of story. And you can't force me to do it, and I'm not doing it. That's it. And he was so shocked he jumped physically. His body, And that was it. From that time onwards, they really haven't, because I guess they know where I stand, and it's non-negotiable with me. But that was the kind of force and control these people had.
Tell me, have you gone back to any of these doctors and said, hey, look, I'm still alive here, and look at all your other patients, they're dead?
I have. I mean, I've pointed out things, and they try and dismiss things, and they try and use an argument that it's not like what you think, the drugs have improved, and it's a manageable disease today. This is the word they like to use, that today we have a manageable disease. And they ignore the fact that there are people like me that are healthy, that they almost want to just write you off the history books, that you never existed, that you're just an anomaly, that no one knows about you, and that you're just a freak of nature, And
an analogy that came to me was that in the 80s they were hitting you over the head with an axe, and then in the 90s they started hitting you over the head with a ball-peen hammer, and now they're hitting you over the head with a rubber mallet. But nobody's asking, why do I need to get hit on the head?
I think as an aside, I won't go into it, I think deep down that they sense something is wrong now. Just even without patients coming and telling them now that, look, I'm healthy, they're not fools. They've seen some of the statistics and data. They've tracked patients. They know that some of the patients have stopped taking the medications. They know now that it doesn't make sense. And they've backed off a bit. I can't speak for all of these patients, but they're starting to get it. But it may be too late because the system is so entrenched. The whole hospital ward and the system and the government and the pharma industry, everything is just all tied into it.
Yeah, a doctor who was 30 when you got diagnosed would be about 55 now. He's probably earning a huge salary.
Yeah.
And he spent 25 years becoming an expert on something that if he rejected it, he'd be a nobody.
Right.
He would not only be a nobody, he would have to admit to himself that he's been poisoning people for years.
25 years, yeah.
It's called iatrogenic illness, doctor-induced illness. They'd all have to admit that they have been actually ruining the health of their patients, not helping them.
Mm-hmm. One of the interesting things is how the hemophiliac organizations sort of marched in line with this whole get on the drugs thing. What influenced the hemophiliac organizations to just roll over and accept the HIV/AIDS paradigm?
Well, that's a really good point, because if you go to the hospital ward, the so-called hemophilia clinic, you'll find brochures by the Hemophilia Society, and most of the advertising and literature is sponsored by the pharmaceutical company. So you'd have to say over the years they've become a kind of a hybrid institution. The Hemophilia Society, in my view, or societies, don't really represent the hemophiliacs. They represent the interest of the pharmaceutical company. And if you go to as I said, the ward, this advertising is extensive. There is pictures of drug cocktails, the different classes and names of the drugs. In the literature, I used to get I still do, newsletters, and they would often be mentioned. They would often mention that so and so has died. Usually, some hemophiliac in the community, and there would be some type of event, maybe a dinner or meeting or something. And it was really, in my view, kind of so morbid, because on one hand they're kind of saying, we're sending notice of this, and they were the perpetrators. They caused it, and the Hemophilia Society would just go along with it. I mean, one of the latest newsletters, they would often say, again, we're commemorating X number of years of the blood tragedy and this and that. So everything, all evidence, all information is ignored. It's almost as if drugs are the greatest thing, that the real cause of the deaths are totally ignored. And then the literature is a celebration of the drugs. It's as if this was the greatest thing that happened to hemophiliacs, and it's the exact opposite. It's a complete lie.
In fact, let's just take a second here to reflect on how the drug companies have really corrupted everything they touch. They corrupt the medical and the science journals with their advertising. They corrupt the gay community with their ubiquitous advertising for these, quote, life-saving treatments. I've watched this occur in the gay press in Washington, D.C. They contribute. There's a group called Metro Teen AIDS. That's the name of it in Washington, D.C. Gilead Sciences, the biggest purveyor of these drugs, donated $100,000 to this small nonprofit in Washington, D.C. Gilead Sciences is the $6.8 billion of these antiretrovirals they sold, that part of a $15 billion worldwide industry. They corrupt everything they touch. They buy off the Hemophilia Society. They buy off all of these so-called nonprofits, and then they peddle through them, using them to basically shill for their life-saving treatments. It is so corrupting, it is so vile that anyone who looks into this, anybody who goes down this rabbit hole, will see that it all tracks back to the drug companies, the continuing paradigm of HIV equals AIDS.
That's right. And, there's a tremendous amount of money, and the whole power structure is protects the pharmaceutical company. And with that, I would mention the media, governmental institutions and whatnot. A big thing regarding hemophiliacs is, for me, back in the late 80s, at the time when I was tested and onwards, was psychological counseling, and also at that time, governmental compensation plans, these types of things. So, as an aside, I just wanted to mention that a lot of hemophiliacs, even if they wanted to or suspected something was wrong, or maybe they didn't get a chance to read the literature like I did, but even if personally they suspected something was wrong, they were kind of dependent on the system, so to speak, because you were once you had this label and that you were positive, you were processed in the system, you were on some type of government check and whatnot. Probably you would attend, when I say this, I mean as a hypothetical, not me per se, but picnics or fundraisers, social events, these types of things. So the control was complete they had over you, physical, psychological, in every way. And most likely you would be on the drug. So you might not, if it was me, probably I wouldn't be talking today to you. I would have been dead a long time ago.
Let's go to how this whole thing has now affected your life. You're around 40 now.
Yes.
How has it affected you personally?
It's damaged me in every way. I mean, first of all, in terms of relationships and my and freedom, I've had to curtail a lot of things. I mean, at one point I was considering getting married, and the person in question didn't know my situation. But even if I told them, I don't think it would have worked. There would just be too much pressure on the other person, and so that's one thing. And then aside from that, it's the stigma. I mean, I saw some of these hemophiliacs die. I mean, they were in their last days. They were suffering from things like liver or kidney failure. And they took the drugs up to the very end. So to me, I feel scarred because I feel that many of these people would be alive today. I want the truth to be out. I feel as if that I have to fight against the system. The very fact that I have to be somewhat hidden to have this conversation with you shows the type of terror that I live under, the type of censorship. I've been to some media types and legal people. In a sense, generally, they don't want to touch this. They don't want anyone who contradicts the official story because it would expose their mistakes. They're kind of beholden to the whole thing because they've been telling this story all along.
So what's been the reaction of journalists?
One told me F off. I mean,
really?
from a major newspaper. I mean, I sent them some literature documents. Even I told them my story, and the response is hostility. If they get beyond the fact that first saying you're a crackpot, and they examine some of it, they'll just say, I don't want to discuss this with you, and that's that.
They basically write you off as an anomaly.
That's it. And even if they did see through it or read something, they feel threatened because their superiors have been telling them to write a certain story, a certain a kind of misleading fairy tale to the public, and that's been the status quo since for over 25 years.
Yeah, the propaganda. One thing that Terry Michael circulated recently was a New York Times article talking about how the AIDS drugs used in poor countries are causing mitochondrial damage. The article was written incredibly cleverly because it didn't point out that those were the drugs that were used in North America 10, 15, 20 years ago. Nor it kind of implied that they were different than the drugs used today, but they're nucleoside analogs, just like the backbone of cocktails today. And so one would imagine that the modern drugs are also causing mitochondrial dysfunction. So if you understand, you see it as blatant propaganda. But if you're an uneducated, at least in this area, if you're uneducated in the whole questions about HIV and AIDS, you would say, wow, we should raise more money to send more life-saving treatments, more expensive life-saving treatments to Africa, as opposed to we would see more expensive poisons to kill Africans.
That article that David is referring to just ended with a quote from one of the researchers here, if you could dignify them by calling that, saying, yes, these things really have some toxic side effects, but they're absolutely essential. It's as though with their own clinicians' eyes, they just willfully commit to ignorance here. It is truly stunning, and it is requiring a paradigm shift that now, 30 years after the first noticing of the immune systems collapsing in a set of gay men, for what those of us who study this understand why. It was because of the sexual lifestyle, the drug lifestyle, the fear, anxiety, and depression, the psychogenic effects, and then it was all laid onto a retrovirus because that was just too tough to accept. As we see 30 years later, all of the evidence that is mounted, people are in such denial. Again, the community of physicians, they can't admit this. They can't admit they've been poisoning people. So it really takes some storytelling like the story you've told us, Brian.
Well, you see, the thing is, stories like mine would counter some of the propaganda of the early 90s. When I read Professor Duesberg's Inventing the AIDS Virus, it was one of the most complete, challenges and or expositions of the whole of all the lies. And he mentioned that Ryan White, who was the poster child, a hemophiliac of I think he's about the same age as me when he died. I mean, in the late 80s, early 90s.
Right.
Well, he was also an AZT victim, and the media at that time completely. They propagandized his death and said that, I think eventually they made certain government acts in his name.
The Ryan White Act, $2 billion a year, almost all of which is spent on the life-saving treatments. They made him not just a hemophiliac poster boy for AIDS, but a poster boy for the drugs.
Right.
That's like was it Johnson Nkosi, that little black kid in South Africa who was adopted by white parents and put on the life-saving drugs and then died, and of course became a posthumous poster child for the benefits of the drugs. It's nobody thinks, well, wait a minute, this person took the drugs and died. Like, what kind of an advertisement is
And now people who make it to their 40s or 50s or 60s and then die after 15 years of these drugs, you see the death notice, of which there are very, very few anymore, and they'll say it was a liver a disease related to HIV. They can't admit that the liver was damaged. I have a friend in New York who's been on the ARVs for 15 years. And several years ago he had a stroke, then he had a heart attack, and his doctor had the audacity to tell him that the heart attack was caused by HIV. They're in denial.
It's a disgrace because these are lies of omission when you think of, for instance, the high-dose AZT that was given to, for instance, a patient like Ryan White. No one could live under those doses. I mean, AZT was the most toxic drug ever prescribed, ever. And DNA chain terminator drug, designed to kill all the cells in the body. And this was given to hemophiliacs. I mean, en masse. So, I mean, it's not surprising that most died within 2 years of that treatment. I mean, you would expect that. But all of this is just put under the rug. I mean, the public isn't given a chance, doesn't hear it, and the survivors are hidden too. I mean, it's for me, it's very frustrating. That's why this type of forum, I'm very glad that I can talk, so I can tell people that I exist and what really happened, because I want justice. I want justice for myself, for the victims, and for the true story to come out, because they've got away with it for too long.
Do you know of any other hemophiliacs like yourself, or are you truly unique?
No, I know of others, but some took the drug or certain drugs for a few years and got off of it, so they might not be as healthy as me, but definitely they're out there.
Right.
I know a few.
Are we seeing that most hemophiliacs now, as they become diagnosed as hemophiliacs, are they being given the test sort of forcibly?
I think it's like a rite of passage. I'm not familiar with other so-called risk groups, but usually if you're a hemophiliac, that would be one of the things they would do, taking your blood. They would always test you. Or
I'm wondering about that, because the story is, and we've kind of forgotten this, the story is they cleaned up the blood supply by testing all of the donors. And so if they started getting hemophiliacs testing positive, then somebody would be saying, well, wait a minute, you told us that you were testing everybody. And if they say, well, we are, then they'd have to say, well, how come HIV is slipping through? So I think it's very important now that hemophiliacs don't test positive, and luckily with the high purity factor 8, they're not their immune system's not being bombarded by foreign proteins, and so they're not testing positive, and that proves therefore that they did clean up the blood supply system.
But I think we have to clarify this. I mean, if indeed we're saying there's nothing in the blood supply that can cause HIV, but people are testing positive, then isn't it quite apparent that they're testing positive for some other reason than HIV?
That's it. I mean, that's it. But the medical community, they're not differentiating that. I mean, what we're doing is analyzing it and then saying this is what happened. But they're not going that far. I mean, they're not even going back and looking at the historical record that there were umpteen scientific papers prior to the advent of the so-called AIDS hysteria in the early 80s that described immunosuppression in hemophiliacs based on the foreign proteins.
My assumptions about the sort of the psychology of doctors, the way that they work, they see somebody for a few minutes every few months, and I don't go to doctors very often, but what I've seen is that they basically don't have any memory of you from the last time. They just have a chart which kind of refreshes their memory, but it's not an area of work that encourages historical reflection. You're just trying to keep up with, what's this person's history of the last few months. I want to make sure that I don't look like an idiot and forget about the fact that he had a heart transplant 2 months ago, and that's why he's here for a checkup. But to go back 10 or 20 years to say, why are we treating HIV this way and how successful it was, I don't think that's part of the training of modern doctors.
I think it's a good time to point out here that since Brian mentioned that, and we've mentioned that hemophilia itself is immune suppressive, it's a good time to mention that those of us who dissent from the single pathogen theory don't deny that there was an immune deficiency syndrome. We don't deny there's immune deficiency. There's always been immune deficiency in human history. What we're questioning is what caused that. What caused that incidence of acquired immune deficiency syndrome in the gay community, among intravenous drug users, among people with hemophilia, and what causes that among Africans who have their immune systems constantly bombarded with old pathogens from malaria and tuberculosis, from pathogens in dirty drinking water, from the fact that they are malnourished. So there are a myriad of explanations for immune deficiency.
You raise a good point. I just wanted to remember something, just in conjunction with what you're saying before I forgot. You raised a really good point. The thing about it is, during my own observation and reading other papers and whatnot, is that the different risk groups had different symptoms and different outcomes. If you look at the gay community that was involved in the partying, the drug lifestyle, the constant activity, and in Africa in terms of bad nutrition and dirty water, and then the hemophiliacs who had their own situation, which we described. It was very diverse or different between so-called risk group to risk group. Yes, they all had type immune deficiency that you could recognize, but different causative factors, and that itself is a clue that the single pathogen theory doesn't work.
Well, another thing
and the other clue is the fact it never spread to white heterosexuals.
Here's another really important thing, is they didn't all get the same diseases. Kaposi's sarcoma was very limited to gay men.
Yes.
Hemophiliacs did not get Kaposi's sarcoma. Gay men were exposed to a lot of external chemicals, like poppers, for example. Hemophiliacs were purely exposed to foreign blood products.
Right.
Blood transfusion recipients generally didn't get Kaposi's sarcoma either.
That's right.
So the patterns of disease within the 30 diseases that called AIDS were very different depending on which group it was. And that also goes to show that it's probably a different cause.
Right, absolutely. I mean, that was... that has become clear over the years that specific risk symptoms and outcomes depending on the group and their behaviors or lifestyle and whatnot. So that would explain the diversity of symptoms you mentioned and why some groups were not getting certain other symptoms. Why Africa was completely different from North America or Europe, or why the gays were different from hemophiliacs. There was some similarity because we, as you said, we don't deny immune deficiency existed. We're questioning the cause.
The CDC, in their annual surveillance report in the United States, used to have a table that described the number of people being diagnosed with AIDS based on the 30 different diseases. So the number of people with Kaposi's sarcoma, PCP, tuberculosis, or whatever. But more than 10 years ago, they stopped producing those statistics. And I don't think that's a coincidence, because people could have used the changes in those patterns to argue that, this was not a single syndrome. And one thing they never did was to break that down by risk group. What if they'd had the pattern of diseases for gay men, IV drug users, hemophiliacs, or whatever other group they wanted to come up with? They might have seen radically different patterns of disease. So the best way to deal with that is just not report it.
Mm-hmm. Right. And when you mentioned the CDC, there was something that came up. I have a document here from 1994 in which the CDC, this is orthodoxy talk and whatnot, they admit that problems with the idea of a single pathogen theory with hemophiliacs. They say something to the effect that, these are their own words, CDC studies have shown that drying of high concentrations of HIV reduces the number of infectious viruses by 90 to 99% within several hours. And why they mention the word drying is because factor VIII has long been known to be supplied in a freeze-dried powder form, which would spend weeks or even months in a freezer waiting use. So even if one wanted to believe in a hypothetical pathogen, that the process of how the treatment was kept and then after that diluted with water and all sorts of stuff and then injected, by their own admission and from a pharmacological point of view, it'd be rendered non-pathogenic.
Well, they say with IV drug users that, after about 15 minutes, the virus is rendered inert on a syringe. Right. But as you point out, in order to purify the blood prior to the artificial factor VIII of today, they had to heat the blood, they had to dry it, they had to physically separate because they were trying to get certain components out.
Right.
And so they had to do all kinds of tricks. And then for ease of shipping, they ended up with this powder that could be frozen and then reconstituted at any time. So they were doing everything that should have killed the HIV virus at every step of the way. And yet the theory is that somehow, miraculously, this fragile little virus, which has knobs on it, which isn't infectious if the knobs fall off, somehow makes it through unscathed and infects all these hemophiliacs.
And, of course, the mainstream, the orthodoxy, will readily admit that this is not a pathogen, if indeed a virus or a retrovirus is indeed a pathogen, and there's some many questions about that, because you can't get it from kissing, you can't get it from toilet seats, because it cannot live outside human DNA.
Unless you're a hemophiliac.
Right.
That must be a special version of HIV that just affects hemophiliacs that's extra tough.
Right. Well, when they test, it's almost like 100%, that, well, not really, maybe 70 to 80%, but it's right away, they're robots after that. I mean, there's no assessment, no thinking, no analysis. That's the problem, because nothing was thought through. There was no, even the fact of my case, without going into specifics and whatnot, the doctor sees me, I walk in, I'm in the clinic, I'm given a test, but I'm a healthy person, and I'm even healthy 10, 20 odd years, and it doesn't matter. As I said, they're more like a robot, because at some point, even if you weren't a doctor, you would say to yourself, why is this person healthy?
I think that's doctors are kind of robots, because what they do, they spend their lives stuffing their heads with medical books that tell them received wisdom, basically. They're not medical scientists. Yes, there are some physicians who are researchers, but for the most part, they're just spitting out received wisdom. And of course, received wisdom is for religion. It's for stuff you take on faith, and that's how they take it. They take it on faith. And of course, they're scared to death of not following best practices, that they're going to be sued. And so they just, like robots, tell them, do what the drug companies tell them to, and of course do what the drug companies bribe them to do, because most of them, in one way or another, are on the payrolls of the drug companies.
That's it. And at this point, I think some of them must have started the questioning, but I think in the early game, I can't blame them fully in the sense of that's what they were. They just followed orders, and I don't think it came to a situation where they were saying to themselves, well, this might be the wrong thing, or this drug is toxic, or and whatnot. It was just, this is what you're supposed to do, and but I think after 10, 15 years, if there was some opposition allowed, or if patients were allowed to speak, and there was open forum where the media reported certain things, such as the victims and who are alive today and whatnot, then we would have had a normal process of correction, so to speak. And but that was never allowed. It still hasn't happened, and that's the tragedy of all of this. It's double tragedy in the sense that these patients had to die, or they were misdiagnosed, and then given the drugs, and then on top of it, there's no correction, no analysis, no allowance for discussion.
We're reaching near the end of our hour here, and I wanted to ask you, Brian, how do you see yourself going forward? What are your hopes for your own personal future and for the future with regards to the mysterious HIV and the amorphous AIDS?
There's many things. I guess I could go on a long time and talk, and it's a limited time, but I want to say that if I could say one thing, and I'm speaking for all people who are in my position, I want, or we want, freedom. And freedom from this, freedom from this medical and scientific dictatorship, freedom from the system that is completely beholden to money, in which the victims don't have a chance to speak unless it's in some type of hidden forum, and and because ultimately the current situation affects the lives of every person who's diagnosed like this, whether it's a legal point of view, from a medical point of view. Their relationships, their whole life. It's like being in a prison, you're not able to do what you want to do. I would like to date who I would like. I would like to, I would like to not have a stigma held over me. I would like to talk about my life and not fear reprisals by either the medical system or the legal system. It's really, I still am in a prison, not in the same sense as bad as it was in the 80s or 90s where I was at risk or they were forcing a drug on you, but in the other sense because you're not free mentally. A lie has been imposed on you for me, in my case, 25 years. And I've also been affected by the deaths of the different people. I know new people, and both in the hemophiliac and non-hemophiliac community, who I know would be alive today had they not been on the drugs, or they hadn't been terrorized psychologically and such. That's another thing we didn't get into, is the psychological terror too. But in addition to the drugs and whatnot, it's both. I mean, that ensures a person, it's very hard to live under that 24/7.
Yeah, I have one last question for you, Brian, and that's who, you mentioned Peter Duesberg, but who have been the biggest influences in providing you with information or support or other things that have helped you maintain your stability and better understand your position?
I would say the Rethinking AIDS community as a whole. I have to thank yourself and others. Definitely that, the actual victims themselves who are not here to speak, but I know their story, and or different stories, so to speak, and so I feel deeply affected by it, and I want justice. Now I look at it for the rest of my life. I figure that there has to be a way that this can be exposed, and of course, as I said, invaluable thanks to the scientists, even people in the dissident media, people who are making films, like the House of Numbers. I really appreciate that. Another person that I think owes a big thanks is the guy who made the factor fraud video.
Right.
Steve Allen. That was a great video that that I think to this day holds up as very strong. Which I wish it could be given to the public. I mean, in a wider forum, or seen by the public, that is. So all of these people who are working in different capacities, people who write, journalists, like yourself, scientists, the victims themselves. We're all in it together, right, and trying to change this.
Yeah.
I think maybe that's an eloquent note to end on here, Brian. Thank you so much for sharing your story, and thank you for your courage.
Yeah, it's an incredible story, and I really appreciate you sharing it with us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And I wish it didn't have to be like this, that I have to speak under these circumstances, that, that's the sad thing, that, 25 years on later, that I'm hidden, but hopefully not forever. I mean, I think I see some hope.
Well, we wish you the best going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.